We have successfully inserted and read from a table that we have in our mobile service. We are now using a database that is inside of the cloud. But currently we're only using it for our users and for the users to be able to log in. It's time for us to implement the same functionality for the posts that we have been adding only locally. So in this lecture, we're going to add the functionality so we can insert the posts that we are currently only inserting in SQLite into a table that we actually have already created inside of the mobile service, which is the post table. For that, we will have to open the new travelpage.saml.cs file. And in here, we are actually already creating a post and inserting it into a local SQLite database. To be able to insert this into the cloud database, we have to change the definition of the post a little bit. And just a little bit because we actually need to know what user is inserting this. Because if you think about it, many users could be inserting into the same table. That doesn't mean that we have to display all of the posts by all of the users inside of the list. We only have to display those posts that come from this user. So I am going to add another property that is going to be a string and that is going to be user ID. So we will have to establish this also before inserting into the cloud database. So back in the new travel page, we will be able to set that user ID. But the question is, to what do we assign this? Well, you remember when we insert a new user into the table, an ID is automatically generated and assigned. And in fact, back in the main page, when we read that user is going to have that ID. So what we can do is get that ID from what we are reading from the table. In fact, we want this user to be always available. And you know what we do when we want something to be always available. We define it inside of the app class. Just like we have the database connection path and the mobile service client, we're going to be defining a user. This has to be public and static as well. And it's going to be of type user. Again, we may need a using directive, and we're going to define this user as a new user. And back in the main page, we're going to assign that user to what we have received from the mobile service. And we're only going to be doing that if the user is different than null. So app.user is going to be equal to the user. And that's it. Now the user, when the user actually exists, is going to be inside of this static element that we have inside of the app class. And back in the new travel page, then we can assign the user ID to be equal to what is inside of the user variable inside of the app class .id. The next step is to actually insert this post into the table that we have in the mobile service. And for that, I am actually going to comment the code that is currently inserting into a SQLite database. Remember that to comment the block of code, you can do /* and close with */. Right below this, then, I am going to insert into the table. This is going to require an await operation, so I have to make the method async. And what we want to await is getting the table through the mobile service. The table that we want is the post table that already exists. And to this table, we want to insert. What we want to insert is the post variable that we have created above. And that will already have the ID for the user. Now, something that we haven't done so far is to execute something once the insert operation is complete. So we can actually do something like we had before, display an alert when the operation is successful. And by the way, now that this is an async method, we can await the operation of displaying an alert. What will happen here is that this line is going to be executed. And the second line or the next line is not going to be executed until this one, the insert async method, is completed. If it is completed, then we can display that it was successful. What could happen for this to be a failure is that an exception occurs. And so, instead of this line being executed, one of the catches is going to be executed. So what we can do is copy the failure message and paste it inside of the catch blocks and await the call. So only are the failure messages displayed when an exception is thrown. So let's go ahead and test this. I'm going to run this on the simulator and I'm going to log in and insert a new post. Because the user is logged in, now the user ID is going to have a value. And actually, before inserting into the table, I am going to add a breakpoint in here to take a look at the post object and see if the user ID has been correctly set. So I have here the Android simulator and I'm going to log in. I will of course have to navigate to the new travel page, and in here I have to first set some location to the device and then select whatever element I want from the list. I can write some experience, click on save, we hit the breakpoint, and if we hover over the post variable, we can expand it and see that the user ID has been correctly set to a string, which is the same user ID of the user that we used to log in. And we can click on continue to perform the operation, and we seem to have received an error. Now I believe I know what this is, and I don't think this has to do with the insertion itself. It turns out that, and you may have noticed, when we insert elements into the database, into the Azure database, the ID is set to a string. And if we go to our post class, our ID is actually an integer. And this was definitely what we needed when we were using SQLite, but I'm actually going to turn this into a string. Now, if I try this again, I should be able to see the success alert. So I am going to run this again on the simulator. I am going to log in one more time, and I am going to insert a new experience. I do need to set the location for the emulator, and I am going to select whatever option I want again. Maybe write some experience, click on save, and I am going to get rid of this breakpoint, click on continue, and now we see the success alert. And now let's navigate to our portal and check what has been inserted into that table. So back in the Azure portal, we can see how indeed both elements were inserted. The first time we saw an error because of the ID. Notice that the ID is always set to a string, not an integer. And we had an integer property, that's why we got an exception. But the insertion was successful. It is in here that we selected some element. We have the venue name, we have the category ID, we have the category name, the address, latitude, longitude, distance, and we have the user ID, which is going to be very important because this user ID is going to be set to the same user that was used to log in. So in here we can see that it starts with BF3. BF3, keep that in mind. I'm going to close this and I'm going to navigate to the user where we have already two users. I created another one to test something out in the next lecture. And here we have the user that starts with BF3, which is the ID of this user that is also being used to identify the posts from one user to another. So when we try this out in the coming lectures and we sign in with this user, we will see the posts that have this user ID. And if we sign in with this other user, we won't be able to see those posts. So we have successfully inserted into a table, but now we're also using kind of like a foreign key, which will allow us to identify posts for one specific user. So we only display posts that that user has added. In the next lecture, we're going to read those posts and filter only those that the current user actually inserted and not all of the posts inside of the table.